you who have gotten to the point where you're working on your results, because this is, the the last push to the end. So congratulations on making it this far. Just a few things, just to go over a couple of our objectives. We're going to be talking about um, scholarly expectations, but also publication requirements. As you move closer to the end, as you move closer to graduation, you may have noticed that not only are there content concerns and scholarly concerns and methodological concerns, you actually may notice some publication concerns cropping up. And this may be a new set of expectations if you have never published anything scholarly before prior to your doctoral work. So we're going to be talking about some of that in terms of tables and figures and the APA expectations for visual displays. We're going to talk about some standard resources that you can locate for writing up your results that are available to you, not just in the Writing Center, but at other centers at Walden. We're going to talk, as I said, about specific quantitative and qualitative writing concerns that you will encounter, whether or not you're doing one or the other type of study. And then I have some special resources I wanted to highlight at the end that hopefully you'll be able to participate in and join us for. So as I indicated, there are lots and lots and lots of resources for people once you reach the stage where you want to start working with your data and writing up your results. And one of those is in the Academic Skills Center. And the Academic Skills Center actually offers data analysis support specifically for people who are at the dissertation doctoral study final capstone stage. So they, of course, won't run the analysis for you. They won't do the analysis and the data collection for you. But once you have all of it, they can actually help you with some of the support software that they have if you want, help, or you have questions about SPSS or Excel or organizing your data, expectations about that. If you have technical questions about working with your analysis and analyzing your dissertation doctoral study data, know that the Academic Skills Center does offer specific support for that. They have people dedicated to that. So if you have not, check that out. It may be useful for you. Also, and as a lot of you probably already know, the Center for Research Quality offers support for methodology and results and data analysis. Center for Research Quality, otherwise known as the Research Office, you can get to both of these places through your student portal. They offer methodology advice office hours, and they offer them specifically for both quantitative and qualitative studies. So they have a methodologist who, in sort of a group advising session, you can sign in live during the posted office hours, and the schedule is on their website. So if you have questions about any, if you're still working on your proposal or you've gotten to the data analysis portion or you're writing up your results, you can go to them if you have questions. Of course, you want to go to your chair first, always, and be sure you're working things out with your faculty, with your overseeing committee. But if you want to, you just have a question you want to wait to see before you submit something to your chair, or you go to your chair or something like that, know that the research office has support for this too, and they have a dedicated methodologist that you can talk to if you have issues that come up. Keep in mind that at the Writing Center, we can talk to you about APA style, we can talk to you about if things look clear, if they seem APA compliant or legible, but in terms of content and that kind of thing, you really want to go to your faculty or the research office for questions like that. So we can tell you, for example, if a table looks right in APA, but we can't really tell you if your analysis in the table is correct. So keep that in mind. Without further ado, we will go on to what is probably foremost in people's minds, and that is how to discuss your data, how to show your data, how to show your work. Because you've done all this work, you've created this proposal that's gone through all of this approval process, you've done all of this crafting, all of this thinking, all of this reading, and then you've actually gone out and collected all of this information as an original researcher. How are you going to show what you did? How are you going to convey this information in a way that reflects what your findings were, but also reflect your prowess and your skills as a doctoral level researcher? So how do we do that? Well, just very basically to start off, as you are beginning to write, for some of you this may be chapter 4 if you're doing a dissertation. For some doctoral studies this may be the second half of section 2. For some people it's section 3. Just depending on the type of study you are doing, this information could be appearing in different parts of your document. But just know that when it comes time to write up your results, make sure you are using the correct template and that you are also using the correct rubric and checklist for your program. And I want to emphasize the distinction between these two things. The template really makes sure everything looks right. So the template is mostly concerned with formatting and APA compliance. The rubric or the checklist for your program, which you can get through the research office, that is really where you go in terms of content. So like the specific headings that need to be included, the specific content that needs to be addressed, the things that you need to talk about when you write up your results, that you need to describe when you talk about the data collection process or things like that. All of that is going to be in the rubric or checklist. So make sure that you are familiar with both and that you are using both so that not only is everything formatted correctly and presented clearly and according to APA guidelines, but you're also including all the right information so that when your URR goes through the document, they can check off, yes, they have this, yes, they have that. So make sure that you are using both documents for their intended purpose. It's always helpful to start with an outline. As you know, those of you who have completed the proposal, a lot of the sections or a lot of the chapters have the headings and the required elements under each heading already there, and that's a really helpful way to outline what you then write up, to just have the headings there and what you're going to put in it, and then you just put in your information. It can make the writing process less daunting that way, because you don't have to sit down and think about writing 100 pages. You just sort of write what goes under each heading. The same is true for writing up your results. You can sort of determine what the necessary headings are according to your program. You can determine what the headings are that are specific to your study, depending on how you want to organize that information. Write that up in an outline, and then you can just fill it in. So those are sort of 3 easy steps to kind of get started, because depending on the type of study you did and the type of information you collected and what your findings were, it could seem very daunting. You have this huge pile of information. How am I going to, organize this in a way where it's actually going to make sense to somebody else? It's always best, especially with a project of this size, to break it into parts and go step by step. So these are some suggested steps for writing up the results section. There is a great passage in the APA manual. I know some people may have people have different opinions about the APA manual. I will put it that way. But I will say that the opening sections of the APA manual are actually a really wonderful, it's just really wonderful writing about the purpose of scholarly writing and the ideas behind writing in APA style. So when you want to when it's time to write up your results, I recommend people read that section in the APA manual. I have page numbers here. You'll see some page numbers at the bottom throughout this presentation for where to go in the manual. But pages 32 to 35 has some really good information about kind of what you're doing when you're writing up your results. And I think it's very useful, especially if this is the first time you've done comprehensive original research at this scale of this scope. So I recommend people read that. But really, the idea when you are writing up your results, you are presenting the narrative of your data. You're presenting the story of your data to your reader. So the idea is kind of like, for those of you who've done your literature review, you don't want to just say, this is what I found. Just like in the literature review, you don't just want a list of, this is what I read. You really want to convey it in such a way that the reader can see what it means. They can understand it in an order that will then kind of accumulate toward your conclusion. So you're summarizing the information that is important for them, and you're describing the analysis in a way that they can really see, as if they're over your shoulder as you're doing it, kind of step by step what you did. So you're leading them through so that at the end of your results, at the end of the section where you've written up and described what you found and what your analysis was, once you get to the end of that section, you really want your reader to understand it as well as you do. You want them to understand where you are at the end of the process. You don't want them to kind of have to weed through it by themselves. You want to present it in a way that they can really follow along logically and understand your process. You don't really want them to have to do a lot of deciphering. You don't want to have to make your reader do a lot of deciphering on their own. You want to make sure that you're presenting it in a way that they can really follow along easily and comprehend it efficiently based on the way you've organized it. One way that people often choose to do this is through visual displays. And when we talk about visual displays in your doctoral document, that will either be a table or a figure. So I'm going to talk about the distinctions between each. There are different things that constitute a table, different things that constitute a figure, and then there's different formatting concerns for each. Make sure you are conversant with Chapter 5 of the APA manual, but I will admit, and I want to make sure that you know, Chapter 5 has all of the information about visual displays, and some of it is very useful. There are checklists and descriptions and lots of things that are very helpful when it comes to making tables and figures. But those of you who have used the APA manual may also know that Chapter 5 is, I think, the most confusing chapter. So just know that. Make sure that you are looking at Chapter 5, you know how to reference Chapter 5, but also know that Chapter 5 is not necessarily laid out in the most helpful way, so be sure you're able to look at some of the examples and information that we have on our website. Also, the main APA style blog has information, so just know that. These are the places where this information comes from, but just for your reference, know that you can, if the manual seems like it's not making sense, you can also go to the Writing Center's website or contact the editors and we will help. So what goes in your tables and figures? You can put both qualitative and quantitative data in a visual display. It's not, if you're doing a quantitative study, it's not required. It's not prohibited if you're doing a qualitative study. There can be reasons for both, and there are compelling reasons for both. So really, it's up to you as the author to determine what is the best way to present this information. You do want to keep in mind that they are necessary. I'll say that again. You want to make sure if you are using a visual display that it is a necessary means of conveying information. Do not feel pressure, or do not feel, just like you don't want to put a lot of, fancy wording in just to sound scholarly, you don't want to throw in a lot of visual displays just to seem doctoral, You don't want to put in a lot of stuff that doesn't need to be there, because especially when it comes to the formatting concerns and the publication concerns, you want to make sure it's worth the trouble, so to speak, because sometimes there's a lot that goes into creating a table or reprinting a table from another source or formatting something so it meets publication requirements. So you don't want to just add tables and add figures because it seems impressive. You really want to make sure that you're including them because they are necessary. It's a necessary way of conveying information. And I think really there are a lot of instances where it is easier to comprehend something visually. It's easier to comprehend something either in a picture or a graph, or if it's spread out in rows and columns, it's actually easier for a reader to understand rather than trying to scan through a dense piece of text or a really long paragraph to kind of pick out what they want. It really is easier to just set it up as a table and a figure. So you want to make sure you are reserving the visual displays for when it actually makes the information easier to understand. You don't want to put pressure on yourself to have tables and figures just because you're doing a doctoral study and you think it needs tables and figures in it. Really make sure that they're the best way of conveying the information that you want to convey. And the other thing to keep in mind, and this is also for those of you who are hoping to publish your data or your information or part or all of your study after graduation, it's important to keep in mind that the tables and figures supplement the text. They relate to the text, but they can also stand on their own. And what that means is, let's say you're going to adapt, let's say you're writing a dissertation, you're getting a PhD, and you want to adapt your dissertation into an article. You want to condense your findings and your conclusions into something that's article length. You submit to a journal, you get accepted, congratulations. But in that journal, just the way the journal does things, they don't include tables and figures throughout articles, they just save them all until the end. Well, you want to make sure that your table or figure is comprehensive enough that if your reader flips to the end, they can still understand what's going on without having the text right there. So that's what that means, is that the table and figure could stand on its own if whoever's publishing it moved it somewhere. It would still make sense, but that it supplements rather than repeats the text that's going on around it. So here's the kind of information that you can put in a table. And rather than I've seen lots of things in table form. Some of it doesn't actually need to go in table form. I've seen some things that really it's just a list of variables or a list of questions. And really it could just be a list. It doesn't have to be in table form, but it's formatted as a table when it really doesn't need to be. So to consider if something belongs in rows and columns. Like if you just have a list of 6 things, you can just list those 6 things out. If there's no kind of, cross column row activity that needs to go on, you probably don't need to make a table out of it. But if you do have information that makes more sense spread out that way, such as these examples we have here, and a lot of it could be statistical, sometimes it could be qualitative, then if it makes more sense in row and column form, consider putting it in a table. But don't feel like just because you have 6 rows but kind of no columns to go along with it, you need to put it in a table. And here, I will skip through the chat because I want to make sure we get to everything. But so here's an example of narrative text that is not very easy to understand. It's pretty dense, and it's just kind of a list of things. And you could see, as you read through this paragraph, it becomes it's split into smaller and smaller sections. So it says the total number surveyed within this group, and then within this subgroup, and then within this subgroup. And it's really just kind of a list of numbers and then a list of percentages. If you find yourself in listing mode like this, where you have a few different categories, a few different findings, and you're just kind of listing it out this way, or you're listing out responses to a series of questions, that's usually an indication that you might want to put it in a table form. Because if you see this as a reader, I have to read through this whole paragraph. I have to read through this whole thing, and then it's going to be hard for me to refer back to what's in the first sentence. And things like that. This is an example of something that actually would look much better as a table. So here's an example of what it looks like as a table. If you can just imagine what this would look like in paragraph form, this would be just the longest, densest paragraph ever because you have, all of these different data points that you need to talk about and that you need to include. Whereas if you just put it in a table, you could say, Table 1 shows median scores by state for boys and girls. Bam, there it is. You don't have to go through a description of it. You don't have to repeat the content that's in the table in the paragraph form. You can just have it in the table and then refer back to it for the specific data that's important to what you're trying to say. That's the other thing to keep in mind, and I will talk about this again later. You don't need to repeat information in paragraph and in table form. You don't need to have a table and then say, this table shows, and then just explain everything that the table has. You can let the text and the table work off of each other. But this is an example of a way that this is really just too complicated to put in paragraph form. It would be hard to read, and it would really slow down your reader, and they wouldn't really understand what you want to tell them, especially if you refer back to the information. So a table's much better. This, however, is an example of a table that is probably not necessary. It's really only one row. There are lots of different columns. There are several different statistical elements that are included, but it's really just one row. And so you look and you can summarize it easily in just 2 sentences. You can say 89 teachers responded to the survey. Their ages ranged from 18 to 66 with a mean of 36. And that's really all the information you need. First and foremost, go with what your chair and your committee are asking you to do. If they have said, I want a table for this, or this is the way I want to look at the information, use tables if they've told you you have to include a table for something. But if they haven't made specific requirements about what needs to be in a table and what doesn't, consider if it just has 1 or 2 rows or just has 1 or 2 columns, really you don't need to have it. Just because there is numerical data does not mean you need to put it in table form. Really, this table actually, it makes your life much more complicated because you have to worry about formatting the table correctly, making sure it fits in the margins, making sure that it shows up in the list of tables, and on and on and on. It's actually a bigger formatting responsibility to put it in a table, so you want to make sure that the data there is actually worth it. So this is an instance where it's maybe not worth it to create a whole table when you can just say it in 2 sentences. So keep that in mind. You don't want to just have tables in there for the sake of tables. You don't want to just have tables in there because there's numerical data. You want to have tables in there because it's actually the best way of conveying the information. Specific requirements for formatting the table, and keep in mind that the formatting is different for figures. I'll go into that when I talk about figures, but keep in mind that you don't do the same thing for all visual displays. But as you've seen in these examples, there's a table number. Below the table number is a table title. Table title is italicized. The table title doesn't have to be, 75 words long. It can be concise. You want to make sure that it actually conveys what's in the table, considering, if they moved it to a different part of the text, would the table title still make sense and convey enough information? and there's no period at the end. Keep in mind that you want to follow the examples in the APA manual, and you want to follow the examples on the Writing Center website. Even if you are reading an APA article from another publication, their formatting may be totally different. So even if you're following the formatting in the books and articles that you've been reading, it may not be strictly correct. They may not have capitalized it in the right way, or they may have periods where periods don't belong. So keep in mind that you don't want to follow the formatting as it appears in something published other than Walden or the APA manual. So just keep that in mind. Table numbers and table titles go above rather than below. And statistical abbreviations are italicized throughout, always. So if you have N equals or anything like that, the N is always italicized. You do have to recreate SPSS. If SPSS spits out a table for you, it's not going to be automatically in APA format. So just understand that you're going to have to make some adjustments. The information will still be correct. The rows and the tables will probably still be what you need, but the formatting itself, you're going to have to adjust. And there's a link there in the slides, and there's also information on our website about specifically how to adjust what you get from SPSS before you put it in your document. And the big thing you're going to have to change is vertical lines. APA tables have no vertical lines. Nowhere, never, not at all. So no vertical lines, only horizontal ones. And you'll see in this example here. So this is basically what your table should look like, with some variances based on what your table is for. You have table number, line below it, table title, italicized, capitalized, table itself, just horizontal lines organized into each column has a heading, and you have what each row is, and this is what it's supposed to be. And this is something that's way more easily comprehended in table form than it would be if I were to describe all of this information to you in a paragraph. And then below, you'll see I have a notes section for any information to explicate any abbreviations or anything like that. So there are stipulations in the APA manual for how to do the table note, but if you do have information you need, whether it's general notes like this one or a specific note or a probability note or something like that, then there are examples in the manual of how to do that, but any of that information goes below the table. Make sure you are introducing the tables in the text for your reader, so you don't want to just go along and have your general discussion and then suddenly you have this big old table show up. You want to, just like you would introduce a guest, you want to introduce your table so your reader isn't surprised or confused by what it's for. So as you're talking, you can introduce a certain element or a certain bit of the data you collected or a certain bit of analysis you did, and you could say things like, as shown in table 1, or you can just refer to it and then put in parentheses table 1, but make sure that you are indicating what the information is in the context of the main text, and then you're including a reference to it so that you can include the table right after it. So make sure you're introducing it before rather than after. You can still discuss it after you've included the table. You don't need to do a complete discussion of it before the table shows up, but you do want to make sure that you give the reader an indication that a table is coming so they know what to use it for once it actually gets there. Number tables consecutively. This is another thing that's going to be different perhaps than some of the articles or books that you're reading. And unfortunately, it's different than what they do in the APA manual. So keep that in mind, that the APA manual itself doesn't totally follow this rule, but the examples on the Walden website do, that the tables are numbered continuously. So you wouldn't have a prefix depending on chapter or section number, for example. You would just have table 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. Numbered continuously throughout the main sections. Once you get to the appendices, if you have an appendix that has multiple tables in it, that the rules for that are a little bit different. But if you just have tables in the main text, or you just have appendix that's one table, you don't have to worry about having prefixes. But I mean, and that perhaps led into lots of questions, but I will pause here because we're about halfway, and I know that was a lot of information. Before I move on to figures and then a more general discussion of quantitative and qualitative, are there any questions I should address?
Hi, Lydia. There have only been a couple of questions, and just this last one I thought I might throw back to you. Someone asked about centering things in the columns. Specifically, this person asked about the respondents being centered. What would you say there?
Yeah, so, and I think that is in reference to this example.
Right.
Perhaps?
I think so, yes.
So above and beyond anything else, your goal is legibility. So I will say that first before I get too far into the weeds. You want to make sure everything is legible. After legibility, you want consistency. So
Hmm.
if you are on your own working on a table, is it legible? Is it consistent? Those are the two main concerns. Once you get down into specific guidelines, column headings are centered. So all of my
Hmm.
column headings here are centered. The row names, I can't think of the word, are left aligned. And so that's why it looks like that. That's why the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 isn't centered underneath respondent.
Hmm.
It's because those are my row titles. Those are left aligned.
Trying to remember, I think they call it a stub column in the
Yeah,
book.
yeah.
That may be the
Thank you.
term. I think
Thank
it's
you.
called stub
Thank you.
column.
Thank you.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
was trying to think of a name
So
for
for
that as
this,
well. Yes.
the stub column has a column title, so it says what goes underneath it, and it's the respondents. And then underneath that, it's left aligned.
Hmm.
So you can mess with the spacing a little bit like this so that it'll fit on the slide as all single spaced, but on the page it probably looks better double spaced. So you may do that if this were actually in your document, and then it might not look so crazy to have all of those respondent numbers over to the side. But just know that those rows, like if you're listing variables or something over there, that's going to be left aligned, whereas the column titles are all centered. But again, legibility first, consistency second. Those are the two most important things.
Okay, and then just one other quick question. Somebody was asking if there's an example of a qualitative table somewhere that you could share, or if you could point us to one.
Oh gosh. I don't have one in this presentation because, as people know, qualitative data can take up more space, and so it's harder to kind of see on a PowerPoint. You
Right.
can, if you are doing a qualitative study, you want to see an example of a qualitative table, what looks good in a qualitative table, you can go, and I have links for this later in the presentation, you can look for previous dissertations or doctoral studies. Off the top of my head, I'm afraid I can't think of a very good specific example, but I know that there are examples in the library in previously published dissertations and doctoral
That's a good
studies.
idea. Yeah, checking out previously published ones. That seems like good advice. Another person is asking if you have to align with the left margin, your table. Does it have to align with the left margin of the template?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it does.
Excellent.
And
And
that's
one
simple.
last question for the pause, I think, and then we can move on. I know you've got a lot to cover. Is it necessary to have notes at the bottom of the table?
Oh, great question. No, you don't. Don't feel pressure to have stuff that you don't need. Like you have to have a title. You have to have columns and row names. You have to have a name for and a title for what's in every column and every row. But you don't have to have notes if you don't need one. If all of the information is there in the table, then you don't need to have it. And you can, if you look through lots of examples, you can see all kinds of stuff that goes below, like citation sometimes, or specific notes, or introduction of abbreviations. If that stuff exists in the table, you need to explain it to your reader. But if, let's see if I can think of actually, let's see. So this example, there's no note. Because I said, so let's say I introduced it in the text. I said, according to table 1, the median, table 1 shows the median scores by state for boys and girls. And then I just showed this. There isn't any information that's not right here that I would need to explain. This is pretty self-explanatory. It's all in either the title or in the information that's in the table. There aren't any abbreviations, so you don't need any note or anything here. This is all you need. So yeah, that's a great question.
All right. Well, I'll let you move on to the next part then. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So here's the fun one, figures. And figures, there's a broader scope of what can show up as a figure than what shows up as a table. So even though tables, there can be lots of different information, it's, stuff that makes sense split into rows and columns. Once you get to figures, it's really a whole lot of other stuff too. It could be graphs, it could be charts, it could be different visual displays that are specifically showing your data and your data analysis, but it could be other things too. It could be, I've seen maps, I've seen, pictures, I've seen models that people developed and they had to create sort of a diagram for it, or processes where somebody sort of did like a visual line picture of how the process worked, or flow charts or things like that. I've seen all kinds of things that are figures. But the same principle still applies as with tables. You don't want to put a figure in there just because it looks fancy to have figures. You want to put a figure in there because it really is a necessary means of conveying the information you want to convey. So keep that in mind, that the figures that you're using really are, try and as much as possible stick with stuff that is presenting your data or presenting essential information. And if there's stuff that you refer to but isn't really immediately necessary for presenting your results, but it's something you want to include, consider putting it in an appendix or something like that. Like if you have, I don't know, if there's a photograph or a map or a flyer or something that you think it's useful for the reader to know, but it's not really useful for them to understanding your specific data that you collected, you can still include it in an appendix, but it may not need to be a figure in the immediate text. But also consider if a table would be better. So if it could fit into rows and columns, you may want to build a table out of it. But if it's actually better as a figure, you would want to make sure that you present it as a figure. So for this, I think I will have you guys respond a little bit. So let's say you're going along, you're reading, I've introduced this figure, and this is what you see. How do you react to this as a reader if you were to see this in an article that you're going through? Yeah, a bit busy. It is definitely a bit awful, confusing for sure. Yeah, it's too crowded, it's too much, and complicated, very difficult to read. Yeah, cluttered and dense, difficult to understand. Clumsy. Yeah, that's a good way of thinking of it. Yeah, and then you would have to look. So there are, a bunch of different colors here. It's sort of complicated, not just to see the information, but it's sort of complicated because there are lots of different, you have to decipher a lot of information about how the graph works before you can even start deciphering the data. Yeah, so really, it's just a lot going on. It's too much information. And this, you can tell this person did a lot of work, though. You can tell that they collected a lot of information and they have a lot of information that they want to show you. But you have to keep in mind that it has to fit within a very specific margin in a very specific size. And some of this text you can't even read because it has to be so small. And I know that people really want to be as comprehensive as possible when they're presenting their information. But it puts the reader to work. That's a good way of thinking of it. You want to make sure you're not making the reader do more work than, as the researcher, you want to lay things out for your reader so they can just get exactly what you want them to get. You don't want to have them on their own kind of having to decipher a lot of information. That's a good way, yeah. Oh, a line graph this may not even be the right format. It could be better as a line graph if there really is all this information. Or there could be dozens of different ways of organizing this. Or maybe this could be like 4 graphs instead of 1 or something like that. But in general, this is an example of the kind of thing that you want to avoid. And I apologize if someone was typing. I didn't mean to cut you off, but I also didn't want to belabor the point. You want to make sure that everything is in digestible pieces. They're bite-sized pieces for your reader. So here, this may be a very useful reference for you as a researcher, but as someone who did not, let's say, interview these students or conduct this survey or do this analysis, this doesn't make any sense to me, really, even if you've set it up in the context of the main text, if you've introduced it in a paragraph, because I can't even really read it, so it's not really useful at all. So this is an example of the kind of thing you want to avoid. This is at the beginning when I said you don't want to just hand people a pile of information and have them sort through it. You really want to do a lot of the sorting yourself, and if that means sacrificing some of the fancy or more complicated figures and for the sake of reader understanding, then that's just something you're going to have to decide. So here in this example, you can see it's calmed down significantly. In this example, I've slimmed down the amount of information that is in here. This is probably a better suited to a bar graph than what was previous. on the previous slide. So this is an example of the kind of thing, it's easily apprehended. I can look at it, and it only takes, a little bit to see, okay, boys, girls, age 4, 5, 6, okay, great, and then I kind of know what the information is. So it's a lot easier this way. Also, you can see it's labeled, but the label is below. So for figures, the label is below. A lot of the labeling for figures is actually the reverse of tables, so keep that in mind. So the figure label is below. This time it's the figure number that's italicized and the caption that is not italicized, which again is the reverse of what it is for tables. And also for figures, it's all on the same line, so it's not separated out. So keep in mind that a lot of what you're doing with a figure is going to be the reverse of what you're doing with a table. Sometimes I see people who've done the same thing all the way through. So keep that in mind. If you have a y-axis, which you don't have to have, but if you have a y-axis, it's labeled horizontally. Color. Sometimes, a lot of people have questions of color, especially if they have a graph or a chart that includes more than 2 categories. A while ago, we said no color because the publication options did not allow color. It either needed to be grayscale or crosshatch or black and white or something like that. Now, thanks to the miracle of modern electronic publishing, color is an option, but you still want to make sure that color enhances the presentation and it's not just there to kind of pop. The point of color, if you do determine that you need to use it, is that it's necessary in order to show different categories, and that also it would not all be the same color if you had to switch to grayscale. But usually black and white, grayscale, crosshatch, that's often, I think, easier and often the better option. But if you do want to use color, make sure you're doing it in a way that enhances the information. Let's see. Oh, I said that already. So here's another example, and this is a little bit muddy, but this is an example that's in the APA manual. And you can see here you have, so this is not necessarily a presentation of data points. This isn't necessarily a chart. This is just kind of a model that the person has come up with. And so they've created this model and they've shown it, with arrows and boxes. And this is something I see fairly frequently. Not infrequently, I guess I will say. And you can create this yourself, or if it helps you to kind of create it somewhere else and scan it in, there are lots of different ways of creating this in your document, but this is how you want to have it formatted. So you have the figure number italicized, here it's an X because it's an example, and then you have the name of it. And then if there's any specific citation or reference information, that's included here too. And I'll say more about that on a later slide, but keep in mind that that all goes below the figure as well. As it would go in a table note or somewhere for a table. I want to point out also, as we're looking at this example, however, in the APA manual, you will notice that there are boxes around figures in their captions. You do not need boxes in your dissertation or your doctoral study. You don't need them. So here you can see there's a line box that's around the whole thing because that's how it appears in the manual. That's not an APA rule. Don't do that in your dissertation. You don't have to do that. You just need the figure. You just insert the figure itself and then the caption underneath it, and then you can just move on with your text. You don't have to put any kind of special, flourish on it. You can just have the figure and the caption under it. And so this appears on page 153 if you want to look in your manual for reference. As with tables, you want to make sure you're introducing your figures. For both tables and figures, you don't want to refer to them by their direction in the text. So you never want to say the table above or below, or the figure above or the figure below. And the reason for that, as you may anticipate, is because depending on if your dissertation is published in a different format or you revise to publish as an article, that table may no longer be above, or that table may no longer be below. The publisher may have moved it somewhere else. So you want to make sure that you are referring to it by number in the text. You never refer to it by direction. And same with tables, you're numbering continuously, figure 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 throughout the document. Same rules apply if you have appendices with multiple figures in it, then you may need to have a prefix, but in general, you won't have to worry about that rule. If it's in the main text, just number them continuously. Reprinting previously published tables and figures. Now, this is less of a concern when you're creating your own tables and figures based on your own data. But if you are you're referring to previous findings, or you're comparing to what previous authors found, or you're using tables and figures earlier on in your document to establish a model or a figure or background or something like that, keep in mind that, as I said at the beginning, it's not just scholarly requirements and doctoral level requirements that you're thinking about now. You have to worry about publication requirements as well. So be aware of what's under copyright. Don't use things that are under copyright without permission. Sometimes I think it's easier to determine if it's under copyright, and then you can really think, well, do I need this? And sometimes you do. Sometimes you do need to include it, but sometimes you don't. That's kind of a good way to cull extra tables and figures that you don't necessarily need. But if you determine that it is necessary, make sure that you obtain permission. And there are, I believe, web links in the web links pod for ProQuest copyright concerns. So make sure you are aware of the information in that guide. And it does have things like sample email text that you can send to somebody to say, hello, I'm doing my dissertation on X, Y, and Z. May I have permission to print your figure, blah, blah, blah. So they have some templates for you if you want to obtain permission. And you want to be careful of copyright infringement. And in the note and caption, if you did get it from somewhere else or you did adapt it from somewhere else, you want to say from or adapted from or reprinted with permission. And there's information on our website, on the main APA style blog, and in the APA manual, and in the ProQuest publication guide. So the information is out there. So if you're concerned that something is under copyright, make sure you look into it and that you address all of that before you then submit for publication. And I will say a few words about specifically writing if you're doing a quantitative study, and this is quantitative specifically. So if you have research questions and hypotheses, and this goes for everyone, but especially, I guess, for people who are doing quantitative studies, make sure the wording is the same throughout. And also make sure the order is the same throughout of your research questions and your hypotheses. That may seem, that may seem obvious, that may seem self-explanatory, but you've been writing and working with this document for a long time, and you may not be constantly checking back and forth between Chapter 3 and Chapter 4, for example. You may not be looking back often at your proposal chapters. And then I have actually seen a dissertation where somebody inverted their research questions. And so what was research question number 2 in their proposal actually turned into research question number 4 in their results. So keep an eye on that kind of stuff. That can happen. So make sure that the numbering is consistent and also the wording is consistent. That every time you list out your hypothesis or your research question in full, the wording is the same. If it's in sentence, if it's in, it's not in question format, you're just referring to it in the main text, like the second research question addresses blah, 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 the wording doesn't need to be the same. But when you list them out, research question 1, research question 2, the wording has to be the same so that it's consistent throughout, so that the reader knows that you're referring to the same thing. And you want to, if you're discussing your results and you have hypotheses, you want to make sure you discuss those hypotheses. And here is typical annotation for that. I see this is one place where the editors can see a lot of variation in how people format the notation for their hypotheses. But this is generally what we want to see if you are using abbreviated notation for your hypotheses. Italicized H, subscript 0, not italicized. For the null hypothesis. And then for your alternative hypothesis, you can have a 1 or an A, but it's still not italicized. And then if you have multiple sets of hypotheses, often you will have the number of the research question. So let's say you have 3 research questions and 3 sets of hypotheses. You don't want to just have H0, H sub 0, H sub 1, H sub 0, H sub 1, because then your reader's not going to know which H sub 0 goes with which question. So you want to make sure you also include the number of the research question. There's more in table 3.58, or APA, excuse me, APA 3.58 and table 3.9. Read the slide, don't listen to me, but there's more in the APA manual. And you also want to talk about your research questions. Specifically, you want to correlate your implications and your findings to the research questions when you talk about them. This we see a lot. You want to make sure you talk about rejecting or failing to reject the null hypothesis. If you have written up your results and you talk about accepting the alternative hypothesis, you want to revise that. So you have either rejected or failed to reject the null hypothesis. and generally that's the form that it should take. Other specific things, italicized statistical symbols. There are some exceptions. So if you look in the APA manual, you'll see what the exceptions are. Like Greek letters, you don't italicize, but and subscripts and superscripts, you don't italicize, things like that. But if you're talking about, N or P values, the P is always italicized. The T in t-test is always italicized. So your statistical symbols are italicized. Check the APA manual if you're worried about exceptions. You want to have spaces on either side of operational symbols, so the equal sign, the less than sign, less than or equal to. You want to have spaces on either side so everything's not smashed together. And for t-tests, if you're talking about just a t-test by itself, no hyphen. If t-test as a word is modifying the word right after it, like t-test results, then you would hyphenate it. But just know that if a t-test is just on its own, you don't have to hyphenate it. Another place that you italicize is anchors of a scale. So let's say you're doing a Likert scale that goes strongly disagree, disagree, neutral, agree, strongly agree. Those would be italicized. And yes, no, also true, false, that kind of thing. If it's an anchor of a scale, then you indicate that to the reader by italicizing it. I think I will pause here. I know that we are getting close, but I want to make sure I pause if there are any specific quantitative questions after what I just said.
Not specific quantitative questions, so I'll hold off.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. To switch to qualitative. So writing up your qualitative results, a lot of your specific concerns are very similar to what goes on when you're doing your literature review. And some of your faculty may even have talked to you about how doing a literature review is like doing qualitative analysis. So a lot of the same things will come up if you're writing up qualitative results. You want to consider the level of detail that is necessary. And sometimes your coding, the way that you've coded and the thematic categories you've come up with is helpful for this. Sometimes it's helpful to organize according to your research question. It really can vary from study to study. This is another example of when it's good to kind of get a sampling of previously published studies from the library, and not even just from Walden. You can just look at previously published doctoral research from any number of places and kind of see how they put this together. So, but you want to have a coherent organizational scheme, whether that is thematic, whether that is by research question. You want to maintain it throughout. I have sometimes seen people through the course of writing up their results, they started one way. So like for research question 1, they wrote it up by research question, but then they sort of switched gears and started talking about things thematically, and it wasn't consistent throughout, so it got kind of confusing. So make sure that you're being consistent, make sure you have some sort of organizational system in place, and that you're not getting so much down into the nitty-gritty that your reader they get lost in the details and they kind of lose the larger picture of the analysis you're trying to convey. Make sure your heading levels are correct and they follow the APA hierarchy. If you do want to get below level 2, and sometimes in qualitative results, you might want to use a level 3 or a level 4. Make sure that that stuff is following the APA format and that it's following the APA guidelines, that you don't just get down. You want to make sure that the heading levels you're using are conveying the correct information. I'll just put it that way. Also, don't capitalize or add quotation marks to your variables. Don't italicize or capitalize themes. And I understand the drive to do that because sometimes people want to emphasize it, or sometimes the way they've worded it doesn't really make sense in the sentence. But you don't want to add incorrect textual emphasis to your themes or to your variables. So don't capitalize or italicize them if they don't need it, or add quotation marks or any of those kinds of things. Really, you just want to phrase it in a certain way that it just makes sense in the sentence, and you can anticipate that your reader knows what your variables are by the time they get to your results, for example. And this is an example of what the headings will look like. Keep in mind that, as I said before, it's kind of hard to fit qualitative data on a PowerPoint slide because it's longer. So just know that this is an example of what the headings would look like. There would be much more text. So it won't look like this in your draft. You may have it outlined this way, and then you would fill it in. So let's say this is your outline, and then you would have your analysis or your description of your data below. But this is one way of doing it. So I have my data analysis, first theme, teachers' experiences of support, or first variable. And then I have mentoring, and then I have theme 1, theme 2, coaching, theme 1, theme 2. Then I get my next variable, influences of support on transfer process. And then below that, you can kind of anticipate that I'm going to have my different categories and then my themes for those categories. And that's one way that you can do it. This is often what thematic organization will look like when you're writing up your qualitative results. But again, the idea is to be consistent and also to make sure that the headings are conveying the right categories, level of categorization. A lot of you who have done interviews are going to want to be presenting excerpts from interview transcripts or focus group transcripts or things like that. And you treat those like block quotations. So you can have here, so here I've described it, one school did not provide new teachers, blah, 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 blah. Participant 6 stated, and then I have my block quotation. So as you can see, it's all, the line spacing is the same, except it's indented all the way down the left side. There isn't any extra indentation on the right side, it's just indented down the left side, and I just have their exact wording. And there doesn't have to be any kind of parenthetical information at the end because I've already introduced it. I said participant 6 stated, and then I say what they said. When you're talking about participant responses, these are some examples of how you can do it. Keep in mind, if you have numbered you want to refer to your participants in consistent ways. So decide if you want to say participant 1, participant 2, participant 3, and then stick with that. Some people abbreviate, they introduce an abbreviation, P1, P2, P3. Sometimes they don't say participant, they say different things. Again, consistency is key. So you're not switching back and forth between spelling out and abbreviating. You're not switching it back and forth between talking about interviewee versus participant. You can decide what you want to call people, but you want to refer to them consistently throughout. And then really you just kind of deal with it as if you're talking about spoken dialogue. You could say participants described, indicated, said that, quote. You do not need to cite your own data. Please do not cite your own data. The purpose of citation is to indicate to your reader where the information came from so that they can track that citation to the reference entry and use that reference entry to retrieve the same information. Data is a whole different ballgame because all of your methodology section is describing where the data came from, and the reader can't retrieve the data unless they contact you because you have the data under lock and key until you destroy it after 5 to 7 years or whatever the IRB agreement was. So data is in a separate economy from the resources that you have on your references list. So you don't have to provide citation, you don't have to say personal communication, whatever the date of the interview was. Because your reader knows it was an interview, they understand the conditions of the interview, they understand it's data that you generated, so you don't have to cite it because your reader already knows where it came from. And check out proper formatting for block quotations. There's a link there, and that's also in the APA manual and on our website if you have questions about how to do block quotations. Sometimes people you want to talk about multiple participant responses at once. This is an example of how you can do that. The spacing is a little bit off, unfortunately, but it's a similar way. You just present block quotation after block quotation. The keys, again, are legibility and consistency. So if it's clear and it's legible and the way that you've indicated the information can show the reader that you're directly quoting a transcript, that's usually fine. Your committee may have some specific information that they require in addition, or they may have specific requirements for how they want it to look. Make sure you defer to your committee if they've told you how they want it formatted. But in general, when it gets to the editor, we want to see directly quoted passages of 40 words or more treated like block quotations. And we want the way that you refer to your participants to be consistent. And we want the thematic organization to be consistent and make sense throughout, in general. So I'm going to go very quickly in case we need time for extra questions. But I do want, if you have downloaded these slides, please do take a look at them. There are some specific revision strategies to keep in mind as you're going through your results section. Some of this is review from what I already covered at the beginning. Do make sure you're using the appropriate template and checklist. Make sure you're looking at things as a reader is going to see them. You are going to be deep in your data by this point, and you're going to be so well versed that sometimes it's hard to step back and see what it would be like to look at it for the first time. So keep in mind, you don't want to have those tables that are super complicated and super dense, or those figures that are really busy. You want to be able to step back and say, okay, how is a reader going to comprehend this? And keep that in mind as you're revising this section. Make a plan, stick to a schedule. That's sort of good practice for all of life. But specifically when you're going through this, make sure you just go step at a time and just work on it consistently. You may not get it all done in a day, and that's fine. It's not designed to work that way. Although those of you who have gotten to the point where you're writing up your results may be able to attest to the fact that it goes a lot faster. That everything sort of comes a lot more quickly than when you're doing the proposal, which can sometimes take a little bit longer. And then break it down into parts and work on different parts at a time. Reminder that there is one-on-one dissertation doctoral data analysis support through the Academic Skills Center, methodology advice hours if you want to talk to a methodologist about what you did or how you're supposed to present it, and the Walden Library if you want to look at previous dissertations and theses and how they presented their data and described their analysis. Please do check us out at the Form and Style website. I want to point out some specific resources we have available for you. We have the Walden Capstone Writing Community, which I will talk about in a second. That is a place for you to kind of see editors work with your colleagues' drafts. You can see drafts in process, people working on their proposal, people working on their results. We actually had a live document review going over somebody's tables last week. So that's a way, it's a closed community where you can see what your colleagues are doing and then see an editor actually work with your document if you're selected as the volunteer, and that's kind of a good way to get revision strategies and writing strategies. Also check out the workshops. Those might be a good option for you, and the Doctoral Capstone Resources site. Speaking of the writing community, however, I want to invite everyone to the self-editing tutorial, which we're going to have in June. And a self-editing tutorial is where an editor will take a document that's been edited, and it's a student-submitted document. Someone will submit their document, an editor will go over it and make suggestions for scholarly voice, APA compliance, suggestions for revision, things like that. And the editor will go through and give examples of how you can self-edit your own document. So you can come see if you're, if you are a member and you volunteer and your work is selected, you can see an editor go through your work. But even if you volunteer and you're not selected, or you don't volunteer, you can still come and watch and ask questions, and hopefully that will help you as you go through your revision process. So if you had a question today, or you think of a question later that comes up and you want to come see an editor go over someone's work, check out the writing community. If you join, you can join us. You can attend the June 8th self-editing tutorial, so please, we would love to see you there. But I see we are also at the top of the hour, so I will see if we have any other questions, and if not, I will turn it over to Dr. Sarah Prince.
I think I've managed to address all the questions that were asked here, so we'll call it good.
Oh, good. Well, thank you, Sam, and thank you, Sarah, and thanks everyone for coming.
Yes, thanks, Lydia, for that insightful presentation. I know she got a lot in the hour. So if you did have a question and you didn't get the question answered during today's presentation, you're welcome to email us at editor@waldenu.edu. Also, you'll see at the end of this presentation slide, we've suggested a couple of other webinars that might be a nice follow-up to this presentation today. So be sure to check those out. And with that, I'll go ahead and conclude the webinar. Thanks for joining us.